Let me first welcome everyone to the first lecture in the Baha'i lecture series, or lecture series in Baha'i Studies, run conjointly by the Baha'i World Center and the Department of Middle Eastern History, and from 2 years ago also the Ezri Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. Under the auspices of the University of Haifa, the Faculty of Humanities. So, welcome everyone. I hope we will have a fruitful and interesting year. Definitely the first title of the first lecture. It's very promising. Today our guest is Dr. Jean-Paul Vader or Vader?
Either way.
You are very flexible.
In English it's Vader, in French it's Vader.
Vader, okay. We remain in the Swiss context, which
Yes,
is
okay.
Vader. He is a professor of social and preventive medicine at the University of Lausanne's Medical School. His principal teaching, research, and service activities are related to the quality of healthcare, an area in which he has published extensively. He is a past president of the European Public Health Association, the umbrella organization for 40 national public health associations throughout Europe, and still serves on its executive board. He is also a member of the governing council of a number of Swiss national organizations in public health, health promotion, and healthcare ethics. Dr. Vader's interest in Baha'i history goes back to his presentation of a brief history of the Baha'i communities in Europe, prepared for the International Baha'i Conference in Paris in 1976. His doctoral dissertation in the field of medical history was devoted to the relation between the well-known Swiss psychiatrist Auguste Forel and the early Baha'i community in Switzerland. In preparation for the centenary celebrations of the Swiss Baha'i community in 2003, he began work on the early Swiss Baha'i history. The title of Dr. Vader's lecture today is Some Aspects of the History of the Baha'i Faith in Switzerland. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to stand up.
Sure.
It's okay. You can see everybody and I won't block your view of the slides. So I've changed slightly the title. Some selected episodes of the early Baha'i history of the Baha'i faith in Switzerland. And what I'd like to do in the 45 or 50 minutes ahead of us is to describe a few anecdotes of the early Swiss Baha'i connections, especially related to the Middle East. Speak about some of the early Baha'is in Switzerland, how they came to Switzerland, how they learned of the Baha'i faith. Refer to some external references, non-Baha'i sources to the Baha'i faith in the early history, and then concentrate a little bit more in detail about Auguste Forel and his activities to promote the Baha'i religion. And hopefully we'll be able to cover this in the time that's been allotted. In the field of medicine, where there are a lot of dollars pushed around, we try to start out our lectures with a disclaimer because, especially among those of us who don't push around big bucks, we like to foster that habit. So a few disclosures and disclaimers. I'm a member of the Baha'i faith, as you could imagine. What I'm going to present here is work in progress, and I say in progress, but it's been stalled for a few years, and I'm very happy for the wonderful invitation that you've given me. It's given me the chance to revive this project that I begun in 2003 with Graham Hassel, a friend of mine, and he moved to Fiji Islands, and then I got an academic appointment, and so we kind of had to push this project on the back burner, and we're trying to revive it now. Selected episodes, it's a biased view. First of all, there are too many episodes to present, and I've tried to select episodes where my unpretentious research has added something new, and I've tried also to select episodes where there's a link with the Middle East. So hopefully you'll find something there for yourself as well. And then finally, I'm not a historian, and I think this will be obvious to those of you who are. And that reminds me of an anecdote I overheard between two of my colleagues, the professor of history of medicine and the professor of neurosurgery. and the neurosurgeon was talking about his interest in medical history, and he says, you know, when I retire, I'm going to be a medical historian. I'm going to write the history of neurosurgery. And the professor of the history of medicine says, oh, that's what a coincidence. When I retire, I'm going to be a neurosurgeon and operate on people's brains. So I mean, I'm acutely aware that simply because you can discover a few historical facts doesn't make you a historian. So I guess I consider myself more a historical detective. I try to detect a few historical facts. And in my lectures to the first-year medical students, I use Sherlock Holmes as the most famous detective. And as you may know, he was created by Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a doctor. And Conan Doyle often referred to the fact that the methods were similar that a detective uses to solve his case and that the doctor uses to diagnose his patient. A big difference that Conan Doyle mentioned was that one of the two had a license to kill. And I'll let you guess which one that was. Anyway, Conan Doyle mentions that actually Sherlock Holmes in The Adventures of the Cardboard Box, he says to Watson, you remember that we approached the case with an absolutely blank mind, which is always an advantage. We had formed no theories. We were simply there to observe and to draw inferences from our observations. I present that to our medical students, and then I proceed to show them that it's impossible to have a blank mind, that we always come with our biases and our heuristics and our slanted view of what's going on. But I do try and help them understand that what's important in the art of detection, as in the art of medicine, is to be able to recognize out of a number of facts which are incidental and which are vital. And I'm not sure that at this stage of my research I've made that clear distinction, but we'll see. So let's dive into some of the early Baha'i connections with Switzerland, especially in relation to the Middle East. The first references to the Baha'i, or the Babi at that time, the Babi religion, were found in newspaper articles, some as early as the 1840s, but very passing references in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. But the more detailed ones were in relation to the attempt on the life of the Shah in 1852. And there were a number of references in 4 or 5 different newspapers throughout Switzerland. And many of them referred to either the attempt itself or to the description of the atrocities that were committed after this attempt on the life of the Shah, where 2 Babis tried to assassinate the Shah. And they often referred to this letter of Captain von Gumwantz, who was an Austrian at the service of the Shah. And this is a brief extract from a letter he wrote to friends in Europe, and which was published in major newspapers throughout Europe. And he says, follow me, my friend, you who lay claim to a heart in European ethics. Follow me to the unhappy ones who, with gouged out eyes, must eat on the scene of the deed, without any sauce, their own amputated ears, or whose teeth are torn out with inhuman violence by the hand of the executioner, or whose bare skulls are simply crushed by blows from a hammer, or where the bazaar is illuminated with unhappy victims because on right and left the people dig deep holes in their breasts and shoulders and insert burning wicks in the wounds. This was an article that was sent from this captain to friends in Europe, and which was published in almost all the major Europes. The Times of London carried this description of the persecutions. Well, as it turns out, this Austrian officer was actually Swiss. The de Goumois family is actually probably the oldest documented family in Switzerland. The documentation of this family goes back to the 11th century, Christian era. And he was one of the last residents of this family chateau in the town of Goumois, which is the name that he had. And actually, in the abstract, it mentions he was the last, but it turns out actually his daughter lived there also. And after she died, it became an old folks' home. So this is an interesting Swiss Middle East connection. I've tried to track down any papers from Goumois. As you know, the Swiss have a long history of being mercenaries in foreign armies, and there's actually a museum of the Swiss military abroad, and I've looked there also and haven't found anything. I found a lot about the early Goumois family, up until the 1700s, but then I haven't found anything related to him. The next link is related to someone who's described as a German doctor, Dr. Josephine Falscher, whose maiden name was Zürcher, meaning from Zurich. And she this is her birth and death, and she spent many years in the Middle East. This is a picture from Haifa in 1908. In the papers that her daughter has left to the Central Library in Zurich, we find this plaque, which says in German, she was one of the first female medical students in Switzerland, and clearly the first European medical doctor in the Near East. And she spent 23 years in Turkey and in Palestine, in different areas. And she spent, I think it was 7 years in Haifa, where she was the family physician of Abdul Baha and a very, very intimate confidant of the female members of the family of Abdul Baha. And what I'll be showing you clearly shows the trust that Abdul Baha had in this lady. As you know, he was quite protective of his grandson, who was destined to succeed him. And in the Baha'i sources that you find, there are very veiled references to what would happen after Abdul Baha passed away, even though he'd written his will. But in the conversation he had with Dr. Falscher, he very open. This is a conversation which she recorded several years later, wrote down. In the room were Abdul Baha, his sister, and Dr. Falscher. And at one point, the young Shoghi Effendi came into the room and was very respectful of Abdul Baha, and then left. And immediately Abdul Baha asked Dr. Falscher, "What do you think of my future Elisha?" And when I saw this as well, who's Elisha? I had to look this up. I suppose many of you know who Elisha was, but I had to look it up. And I came across this interesting illumination from the Porter Bible that is in our university library in Lausanne from 1275. And there's this illumination of Elijah going off into the clouds with his chariot and leaving his mantle, the symbol of his prophethood, on Elisha. And so clearly Abdul Baha was very explicit about Shoghi Effendi and the role that he was destined to play in the following the passing of Abdul Baha. And then Abdul Baha goes on to say, Baha'u'llah chose this insignificant one, referring to himself, to be his successor, not because I was the firstborn, but because his inner eye had already discerned on my brow the seal of God. Before his ascension, his death, Baha'u'llah reminded me that I too, irrespective of primogeniture or age, must observe among my sons and grandsons whom God would indicate for his office. My sons passed to eternity in their tenderest years. In my line, among my relatives, only little Shoghi has the shadow of a great calling in the depths of his eyes. At this time, Shoghi Effendi was only 12 or 13 years old, so clearly there was a destiny for him. And what's interesting is that Dr. Falscher, and we'll come back to her later, talking about Auguste Forel, she spent many hours with Abdul Baha asking questions and writing down his answers, and she sent that to her friends in Europe, and these were published. And as it turns out, this was one of the sources that Auguste Forel had of what the Baha'i teachings were, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But then, another thing that Abdul Baha mentions is that he was planning on sending Shoghi Effendi to England for his education. He says, at the present time, the British Empire is the greatest and still expanding, and its language is a world language. My future vizier shall receive the preparation for his weighty office in England itself, after he has obtained here in Palestine a fundamental knowledge of the Oriental languages and the wisdom of the East. So again, not only his succession, but also the fact that he had planned on sending Shoghi Effendi to England for education. Interestingly, Dr. Falscher expressed doubts about the fact that wouldn't the fact that you're sending him to England corrupt his pure nature by the materialistic society of the West. And Abdul Baha mentioned that no, he would be protecting Shoghi Effendi from the corruption of the West. And then Dr. Falscher finishes this particular episode from her memoirs by saying, in November 1921, while staying in Lugano, that's a city in Switzerland in the south, I learned of the passing of Abbas Effendi Abdul Baha in Haifa, and my thoughts and memories turned back to that long ago hour in August 1910, and I wish Elisha Shoghi well in everything that is good, inshallah. So very, very interesting, and the fact that it was so explicit, whereas his references among the Baha'i sources were very veiled, and I think in terms of protecting Shoghi Effendi from the malice of some of the enemies of the family. And what's interesting is this, and this may be something for you, that there are two books about this Dr. Falscher. One is a doctoral dissertation in the field of history of medicine. They're both in German, unfortunately, but this one is called A Female Doctor in the East, Even When the Sultan Doesn't Like It. Yeah. And then there's these memoirs from the daughter of Dr. Falscher, which she describes. It's mainly focusing on the time that they spent in the Near East. So two important sources about the relationship. Well, the Baha'i faith is only a small part of this, but there are important references in these two books. So then, moving on to early Baha'is in Switzerland itself, the very first Baha'i to take up residence in Switzerland was Edith Mackay. She became a Baha'i in Paris in 1900, and she was one of the first to convert to this religion through the efforts of May Bowles, who had been sent to Paris by Abdul Baha at the turn of the century. She was a French-American. Her mother was French, her father was American, and with her mother, who also converted to the Baha'i religion shortly thereafter, they came on pilgrimage in 1901 and spent time. There are a number of photos, and I'm not sure, this is from a newly written manuscript by the granddaughter of Edith Mackay, and she mentioned that this is in Haifa. I'm not sure if it's in Haifa or Akka. Anyway, there's this picture of her in 1901. She came here with her mother, who had recently accepted this new revelation. They spent 15 days with Abdul Baha here in the Holy Land.
Is a well?
There's a well, yes. I don't know. That might help identify where it is. If there are other pictures from the area. There's one very similar with her mother beside the same well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So with Edith Mackay, then while on vacation in 1903, met her future husband here in the Rhone Valley in Switzerland, in Sion, and they married. And he shortly thereafter he became a Baha'i also. He was a local dentist in Sion, and they settled there. And in 1903, then was the date of the first settlement of a Baha'i resident in Switzerland. Shortly thereafter, they came on pilgrimage again with her husband, and then from 1907 until 1911, the Mackay family lived in Cairo, and they met Abdul Baha when he was in Egypt in 1911, and actually it was there that Dr. Mackay received the decoration of the Commander of the Order of the Lion and the Sun from Muqtadir al-Mulk for having treated Muzaffar ad-Din Shah when he was on vacation in the Rhone Valley at one time for a dental problem.
They didn't know that he's Baha'i.
Probably not. Probably not.
Maybe he revealed that when he was pulling it in.
Maybe. Yes, I have something to tell you. So I haven't been able to identify when the date of when Muzaffar ad-Din Shah was in the Rhone Valley and received this treatment. So then one of these early references was in Sion, the Mackay family. The other was in Mont Pelerin, which is a mountain above Vevey, above Lake Geneva. And here, one of the first French Baha'is, Hippolyte Dreyfus, actually, and I can't confirm that 100%, But Edith McKay was probably the first French lady to become a Baha'i, and Hippolyte Dreyfus was probably the first French man to become a Baha'i in Paris. And he, with his family, had a villa up above Lake Geneva, and they called it Dar es Salaam. He was an Orientalist. He was fluent in Arabic and Persian, and actually was above Lake Geneva in 1908 that he completed his Essay sur le Bahaïsme, which for many years was the major reference about the Baha'i faith in French. And even today, it is remarkably up to date, even after a century. It's still a major introductory book that is used for the Baha'i faith in French. So it was here that he completed that work, and it was also here that many of the early European Baha'is came to stay or to work on some of their things. Among them, but no, not yet, was Lady Bloomfield, and we'll come to her in just a minute. Perhaps one of the big significant elements in the early history of the faith was the brief stay of Abdu'l-Baha in Geneva and Vevey. This was the first major city that he stopped at on his tour of the West in 1911. And he was staying in Tournon-les-Bains across the lake, and then he came to Geneva the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of September of 1911. And there are brief mentions of that in 4 local newspapers, and these are perhaps the first Western media reports of the extensive trip that Abdu'l-Baha made to the West. We have very little information about what transpired during these 3 days, but we do have, it was there that he sent a letter on the 3rd of September to Edith McKay, who was living then, was back in Switzerland at the time. A brief letter. We don't have the original of this, but here's the translation with the signature of Abdu'l-Baha. Among those who were at Dar es Salaam, the villa of the Dreyfus, and who met, of course, Abdu'l-Baha, was Lady Bloomfield. She was present at many of his talks in Paris. And it was actually in Mont Pelerin that she completed the transcription of this book called Paris Talks, which was a compilation of the talks of Abdu'l-Baha during his extensive stay in Paris. And that was in January of 1912. She was in contact with Abdu'l-Baha immediately at that time, and he strongly encouraged her to develop around Lake Geneva the Baha'i teachings. In a letter of February 12, 1912, he said, "Thou shouldst, together with Mrs. Gibbs," and I'm not sure if this is a proper translation. I know that Lady Bloomfield was very much in contact with Eglantine Jebb, the founder of the Save the Children Fund, and so I'm not sure if this is her or and it's perhaps a different transcription of the name. But anyway, he encouraged her to establish a center on the coast of Lake Geneva. A month later, he refers to asking her to, wherever she goes in Switzerland, to open her tongue and speak about the Baha'i teachings. He also mentioned that she should make a trip to Lausanne with a party and meet Riaz Effendi. We'll hear more about him in a minute. And there give lectures to the Persians. And then he says, continue the Wednesday meetings in Villeneuve. So there are a number of different centers that she was apparently cultivating with the Baha'i teachings. And as it turns out, a few years later, and I came across, through the efforts of Rob Weinberg, this reference in the Christian Commonwealth, a short notice that there will be a Baha'i center shortly in Geneva, the city of the Reformation, the Reformers, famous in the history of Europe as a center of spiritual and intellectual life. There are Wednesday meetings on consecutive Wednesdays that were addressed by Mrs. Holbach and Lady Bloomfield and so on. And it's interesting that the reference is here made to the fact that it's the city of the Reformers. And actually, Geneva is unofficially probably the capital of the Reformation, as Rome would be the capital of Catholic Church and so And this is a picture of what they call the Reformers' Wall in one of the major attractions in Geneva of some of the important people of the Reformation. So I think it's important in terms of the importance of Geneva as a center of the Baha'i teachings. And Lady Blomfield was very active, not only with the Baha'i teachings, but also in the Red Cross and the Save the Children Fund, which was actually it's a non-governmental organization that's still very active in defending the children who are victims of war. But she organized with a number of other Baha'i ladies in Geneva these informal gatherings, and among those that were attracted were Homer Roland, Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950. He was among many of the intellectuals at that time in Europe. They were very, very disappointed and troubled by the war. The intellectual atmosphere of Europe was very much impregnated by the German spirit and the French spirit and the English, and they couldn't understand how Germany and France could go at each other's throats. And they tried to be above this and to foster the spirit of peace among the warring nations. And it's interesting, he describes, he was as a very prolific writer, and he had a very extensive personal diary. There are volumes and volumes and volumes of his personal diary, and most of them are at the University of Basel. And most of them are not published, although many people who are not familiar with him think that there's a published volume of his memoirs, but it's only a very small part of it. And I came across in his diary what is probably his first encounter with the Baha'i teachings, and I'll give you a translation of it in a minute. But he refers to, this was in 19 of March 1915, and he says, and this is my translation, "I go to a small closed meeting in the studio of a Dutch lady, Mrs. van Hatten," gives her address, "to hear an Egyptian Baha'ist, Raed Zalem," I think it's Riaz Zalim, "a cold rainy day, a dozen people, quiet, somewhat self-effacing, a young man, tall, rather corpulent, with a huge shaved head, reminding one of an ancient Egyptian scribe or a great Assyrian eunuch, speaks softly, slowly, groping along, trying to find his words in French, introducing without realizing it overly familiar terms into his grave exposition. Thus, when speaking of Jesus with great emotion, he says that his most sensational miracle was of a spiritual nature. Congenial and likable by reason of his simplicity and humility, he tells how he came to Babism." And then he goes on for about 3 pages describing what the content of this informal meeting with Riaz Salim. And apparently this encounter had a profound effect on him, because in a lot of his future reference to the Baha'i faith, he refers to this meeting. In one letter, I don't have the date on it, to Mrs. Jean Stannard, he says she was heading the Baha'i Bureau in Geneva in the late 1920s. She contacted him apparently. He says, "I'm somewhat familiar with and honor the Baha'i movement. In 1915 in Geneva, I participated in some Baha'i meetings, and Mrs. van Hatten's, where a very interesting Egyptian Baha'i, Riaz Salim, spoke." And in a letter to Charles Baudouin, he says, "I met at Mrs. van Hatten's an interesting Egyptian Baha'i." To Nicholas Rubakin, very famous Russian intellectual who lived in Switzerland for a long time, he says he met this Egyptian Baha'i, was an intelligent and charming person. So this is apparently had a large impact upon him. I still am trying to track down more information about this Riaz Salim. I have a few informations. I know that he was a medical student in Lausanne from 1911 to 1915. I know that he never got his medical degree. There's some reference in this letter from Abdul Baha in 1919, where he speaks about him studying social sciences. So maybe he changed his orientation. There's a passing reference to him being in Paris in 1913, and then there's the reference we just saw from the diary of Homer Roland. But again, he seems to be a fascinating person that I would like to learn more about. Another person who was attracted to the Baha'i teachings then was Charles Baudouin, and there was one reference to the correspondence with him and between him and Romain Rolland. He was at the time he was a young man. He wrote an article, 1917, so he was only 23, 24 years old. He later went on to become a very famous professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Geneva. At the time, he was a very young man, and he wrote this article called, there's a collection of his articles in English, and the translated version is called Bahaism, a movement towards the community of mankind, Bahaism, un mouvement vers la communion humaine. And it's amazing, this is such an extensive and complete article by such a young person that he was obviously very, very strongly attracted to the teachings at that time. We find several references to him in the 1920s, and then there's a stop. And again, I've tried to contact his family. My friend, professor of history of medicine, who's done some work on Charles Baudouin, he says that I should be patient, that the family always takes a long time to answer, but I've been waiting a few years now. I would still like to hear more about what happened. That there was, at one point, there was a very, very positive article about the Baha'i faith published in French, and then there was just a complete blackout. And this is a brief extract from this article. He says, "We Westerners are too apt to imagine that the huge continent of Asia is sleeping as soundly as a mummy. As Europeans, we believe that Europe to be the only world that matters. Nevertheless, the great cataclysm of 1914 is leading some of us to undertake a critical examination of the inviolable dogma that the European nations are the elect." But really, the intellectuals in Europe were really troubled by the First World War. And when you read, especially the diary of Romain Rolland, it gets you here to see how much they were suffering from the fact that these two nations were tearing each other apart. And he says, being thus led to turn our eyes towards Asia, we are astonished to find how much we have misunderstood it. And we blush when we realize our previous ignorance of the fact that towards the middle of the 19th century, Asia gave birth to a great religious movement, a movement signalized for its spiritual purity, one which has had thousands of martyrs, one which Tolstoy has described. H. Dreyfus, the French historian of this movement, said that it is not a new religion, but religion renewed, and that it provides the only possible basis for mutual understanding between religion and free thought. Then he concludes, such is the new voice that sounds to us from Asia, such is the new dawn in the East. We should give them our close attention. We should abandon our customary attitude of disdainful superiority. Baha'ist teachings may serve amid our present chaos to open for us a road leading to solace and to comfort. They restore our confidence in the spiritual destiny of man. It reveals to us how the human mind is in travail. It gives us an inkling of the fact that the greatest happenings of the day are not the ones we are inclined to regard as the most momentous, not the ones which are making the loudest noise. Very interesting the way he was very, very positive about these teachings. So that's some of the early references from the non-Baha'i sources to the Baha'i teachings. Auguste Forel was also a member of this intelligentsia of European, and I guess the difference is that he actually adhered to the teachings and did quite a bit to promote them. He was much older than the Romain Rolland or Charles Baudouin, and when he met the Baha'i teachings, he was actually in his 70s. And he was much more well known than the others. At the time that he met the Baha'i teachings, he was a world-renowned entomologist, anatomist, psychiatrist, philosopher, social reformer, peace activist, writer, women's suffragist. He's been described as, quote, one of the last examples of the encyclopedic mind which was interested in all fields of human endeavor. And today it's almost impossible to have that broad approach, but he really was interested in everything. And he, just a brief excursion, because of his importance in Switzerland, there was a postage stamp that was made in his honor in 1971. The 1,000 franc bill, probably one of the most valuable bills in the world. The 6 theories, which is now out of print, was devoted to him. You see, this is him, a cut through the human brain. He was a neuroanatomist. He discovered a number of structures in the human brain. And then ants, he was the world specialist on ants at the time. And he learned about the Baha'i teachings from his daughter and son-in-law, who lived in Karlsruhe. He went there for the Christmas holidays to spend time with them. And they had just become Baha'is, and he discovered this new religion, which seemed to have all the social principles that he had worked for all of his life. And it's interesting because he he was very much anti-clerical and anti-religious, but about 1910, he felt that religion was important because of the social network that it created. So he recognized the social value of religion, but didn't want the theological aspect of it. So what he did, he created his own religion called the religion of social good, and he propagated that, and he had small cells of communities that would sort of put the social good as the highest value to work for. Well, he learned about this from his daughter and son-in-law, and also when he came back to Lausanne, he was in contact through letters with this young student, Abdul Hussein Isfahani, who was studying law in Lausanne at the time. And there's quite a correspondence between them about the Baha'i teachings on the nature of man, about the nature of God and the universe and so on. And he obviously was very much respected by Forel and had a big influence on Forel's thought. Well, when Forel met the Baha'i teachings through his daughter and son-in-law, he immediately, just an aside, I'm still tracking Abdul Hussein Isfahani as well. What I know from the records of the American University, he was a student there in 1915, 1916. He got his BA in 16 and his master's in 1917. He may have been a fellow student of Shoghi Effendi when he was there. It's speculation. He was a law student in Lausanne, 1920 to 1923. From a letter of Shoghi Effendi, we know that he was in Cairo in 1925. And the records of the American University of Beirut indicate that he died in 1931, rather young. One of the addresses that I have for him was a tuberculosis clinic in the mountains in Switzerland. So I assume that he had tuberculosis and may have died of consumption at a fairly young age. Well, Abdul-Baha, August Forel, when he encountered the Baha'i teachings, wrote immediately to Abdul-Baha a very long letter explaining kind of his conception of religion and the history of his conception, leading up to his creation of this religion for the social good. And he explained what his sources of the knowledge of the teaching of the Baha'i faith were, including, interestingly, a number of letters written by a female Dr. F. In 1910. And he says, I'm amazed, were these letters really written in 1910 before the World War? If so, I'm amazed at your prophetic vision, he says to Abdul-Baha. So Dr. F was really Dr. Falscher, who was the family physician. So after going through this long explanation, he says, may I, yes or no, belong to the Baha'i faith with the agnosticism I have mentioned above without deceiving myself or others? He was a fanatical in his sincerity. He really wanted to be sincere. He didn't want to be a hypocrite in any way, or even perceived as one. So he wanted to be sure that Abdul-Baha understood what his own conception was. And then he says, it's only to explain my question that I've said above, those points which I consider the Baha'i faith deviates from my own belief. For all the rest, I can only admire and wholeheartedly support you. Well, this was written in December 1920. Almost a year before Abdul-Baha passed away. And the answer didn't come until February 1922. So more than a year later. Well, Forel apparently was impatient or found his answer somewhere else, because he gave his own answer when he revised his will and testament in August of 1921. He added this codicil, in which he says that Karlsruhe in 1920, I first came to know the super-confessional world religion of the Baha'is, founded in the East more than 75 years ago by the Persian Baha'u'llah. This is the true religion of human social good, without dogmas or priests. Uniting all men in this small terrestrial globe of ours, I have become a Baha'i. May this religion live and prosper for the good of mankind. This is my most ardent wish. So he decided that his belief was compatible with the Baha'i teachings. Well, the answer came again in February of 1922. This is the accompanying letter from Shoghi Effendi, where he says, "It is with regret and sorrow that I enclose at last the long-protected translation of Abdul Baha's answer to your letter. His sudden passing to the great beyond has plunged us all in profound grief and added heavily to our preoccupations and responsibilities. Happily, however, the full answer to your epistle had been written and signed by him many years before his passing, and were it not for the desire to have it adequately rendered into English and French, it would have reached you far sooner than now." So this was actually 3 months after Abdul Baha had passed away. And it's interesting, this long letter that Abdul Baha wrote to Forel has been described by Shoghi Effendi as unique in many respects, much appreciated by its nature and comprehensiveness, one of the most weighty that Abdul Baha ever wrote. It deals with the nature of God, the nature of the universe, human nature. So it's a very, very profound and philosophical letter, about 6 pages. So it's very, very long. It's been the subject of a number of studies. Well, what did Forel do then to ensure that the Baha'i faith would live and prosper for the good of mankind, as he mentioned in his will? Well, his activities in the last 10 years of his life included the founding of Baha'i groups, organizing Baha'i meetings, defending the Baha'is in Persia, mentioning the Baha'i faith in his principal works, writing original articles, and mentioning the faith in correspondence and personal contacts. And I'll mention a few of these. This is his house in the Rhone Valley, called La Fourmilière, the Ant's Nest, which was named by his wife. And it was a stream of visitors, Baha'i and others. And fortunately, his wife kept a diary. And from his diary, we can see a list of a number of the prominent Baha'is at that time who came to visit Auguste Forel at that time. Fortunately, we were able to save his wife's diary, and the Institute of the History of Medicine in Lausanne now has a digitalized copy of her. There are about 30 volumes of her personal diary. Usually very telegraphic notes about what happened each day, but it's an interesting source of what went on in the Ant's Nest, Forel's house at the time. One of the people he corresponded with was Romain Rolland. They lived not far away, and apparently Forel had sent him a book and mentioned the Baha'i faith, and Romain Rolland writes back and says, "My dear friend, thank you for having sent me the book. I was already familiar with Baha'ism. In late 1914, I participated in Baha'i meetings in Geneva, where people from warring nations came together in a spirit of brotherhood. At the time, I read many Baha'i brochures." And he says, "Towards the end of my book, Clérambault, I have my hero quote a wonderful passage from Baha'u'llah. You see, the Baha'is are old friends for me. There's a wonderful force of renewal in the East." The quote that he has in his hero is not from Baha'u'llah, it's from Abdul Baha, and he only refers to him as the seer of Akka. And in some of his later correspondence, he expresses his disappointment that no one ever asked him who the seer of Akka was. He was expecting that people would be very curious to know who that was, but he says, no one even ever asked me. Another interesting bit of correspondence is with Dr. Falcher. There's a postcard that he wrote to her, and it says, "Dear colleague, thank you very much for your kind letter of 13th of October, 1926, that was, from Jerusalem. I have not forgotten you, nor your dissertation on Joan of Arc that you wrote in 1895. As it turns out, Forel was her director of her medical thesis on Joan of Arc at the University of Zurich in 1895. You must no doubt know my dear Baha'i friends in Haifa. I correspond often with Shoghi Effendi, and am myself a Baha'i, and you. Warm greetings from our house to yours, also to Mr. Falcher, your devoted old cripple. Forel at the time, he had in 1916, he suffered a stroke, and so he was paralyzed on his right side. He had to learn to write with his left hand. So another interesting piece of correspondence with the same Dr. Falscher, who was here in Palestine. Another interesting of his activities, defending the Baha'is in Persia. As you probably know, in 1925 to 1927, there was a wave of persecutions in Persia, and Shoghi Effendi asked Forel to use whatever influence he had to bring that to the attention of the European public. And he did so by writing to the League of Nations, to the French Premier, to Kemal Pasha, and publishing articles in major European newspapers. This is from the archives of the League of Nations. Forel writing to Sir Eric Drummond, who was the Secretary General of the League of Nations at the time, asking him for the League of Nations to intervene to protect the Baha'i minority. The answer he got was rather disappointing, saying that since Iran was not a party to the League of Nations, the League of Nations couldn't really do anything. And then a final reference to his fact that he constantly brought up the Baha'i teachings is in an article in this weekly magazine, which still exists in Switzerland, L'Illustré. Probably you have the same thing in every country in the world. These picture magazines that come out every week. I think about Life magazine in the United States. Well, there's an article by this young journalist, Fernand Gigon. He was only 23 at the time, and probably one of his first assignments. He later became a specialist in China and was a very well-known journalist in the 1970s and 1980s in Switzerland. But one of his first articles was about Auguste Forel. And in this article, he refers to the fact that he was looking around, visiting the Forel for the interview, and he says, in a corner lie piles of journals and reviews, articles or stories which have been devoted to this great erudite thinker. I stop for a moment to take a closer look at what constitutes, in the eyes of most men, their glory. But Forel does not give me time to look. He laughs mischievously and lets out a disdainful bah, which says a lot about how much he cares for human vanity. Do you know this man? Forel asked me, handing me a photograph. He is Abdul Baha, the successor of a Persian who created a marvelous movement for establishing universal peace. The basis of his doctrine is truly admirable and above all magnificently generous. He calls for the equality of the two sexes and for the obligation for all to work. No more idle rich or unemployed poor. He also calls for everyone to learn a universal language. I think Esperanto would be the best. And then Forel goes on, yes, this man is remarkable. He understood perfectly, he's referring to Abdul Baha. He understood perfectly well that a new religion could not ignore social and economic problems. Already 60 years ago, he laid the foundations of a League of Nations and an International Court of Justice through arbitration. Today, these institutions exist, but they lack the courage to condemn acts that go against the peace of all nations. And then Forel, Gigon says, at that moment, we're informed that tea has been served. So that kind of breaks off the interview at that point. And that's probably where I'll break off now, this brief overview of some of the episodes of the early Baha'i history in Switzerland. I'd just like to mention a few important episodes that are not covered here. Shoghi Effendi spent many months in Switzerland getting rest from his burdens as guardian of the Baha'i faith. There are a number of early Baha'is that are very important that I have not mentioned here. Anna Kunz, she was the daughter of a very famous Protestant minister in Zurich, spent many months in Zurich. Fritz Sebney was the first Baha'i in the German-speaking part. John and Louise Bosch, who were Swiss, who became Baha'is in the United States. There was the International Baha'i Bureau in Geneva, which functioned under the direction of Shoghi Effendi as of 1925. And there were many Baha'i travelers who passed through Geneva, meeting Forel or visiting the Baha'i Bureau there. 1930 really begins a lull in Baha'i activities. And that's why I've kind of chosen this as a cutoff point for these early episodes. And I often ask myself, why this lull in the 1930s? And I guess my obvious answer at the beginning is, well, maybe I just haven't found the documentation and I should still keep looking. But there are a few other hypotheses that are not my own, from discussions and other sources, the early progress was very much linked to strong personalities, either within the faith or without. People like Forel, Blomfield, Baudouin, and Roland. And when they moved on, either to the next world or to other interests, for example, Roland, he became a very, very ardent communist and sort of forgot about religion completely. Then the whole thing just seemed to disappear. In addition, I guess the means for capitalizing on the initial developments were probably lacking. There were no Baha'i communities, there were no Baha'i institutions, there were limited financial resources, and the methods for, I guess, sustaining this growth were also lacking. And there was also this very, very pronounced despondency and moroseness that set into the intellectual atmosphere in Europe following the fact that there was so much hope at the end of World War I that peace would really, it was the war that was to end all wars. And for a number of these intellectuals, I think the Baha'i religion sort of symbolized that hope. And when they realized that the peace was not going to come, I think that their whole hope just kind of fell apart. And so those are some of the hypotheses that I have about perhaps why 1930 just was a low point in the Swiss Baha'i history. So with that, I'd like to open for any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you very much for disclosing for us a very dark, I would say, or unknown field of Baha'i studies. And it's the floor is open for questions for those who are interested in any specific aspect. And I must say it was very historical what you said, so don't, especially at the end, all this interesting.
Is there equivalent movement anywhere else at the same time, or later or before?
In Switzerland or general?
No, beyond Switzerland and France.
Which period you're talking about?
We're talking about Switzerland.
Yeah.
No, which period? We're
It
talking.
doesn't matter what period. I want to know if this was a singular phenomenon led by those personalities actually and spread out, or were there other attempts in, I don't know, in England or the States or in Russia, for example?
You see, that's where you would really need a true historian to answer the question, because I mean, what I've done is tried to look at one aspect, discover things that I'm looking for, and in a context that I know, which is Switzerland. So I think that's the element where you really need someone who has the general overview to put that in the perspective, real historical perspective. So I really can't say. Maybe others would know.
Okay, we're going to ask for the next speaker.
Well, if you're talking about the foundation of the Baha'i faith and the
Yes.
if you talk about mid-19th century, then you have.
What I'm interested in, that was the spread only in Persia at those days, and then how some bloomed out in Switzerland and by Bloomfield, by the German doctors, or were there other branches somewhere?
From the Baha'i faith?
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought you meaning other movements, non-Baha'i movements.
No.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, there were sort of budding communities throughout Europe in the early 1920s, 1930s. France was one. England was another. Germany also. There was quite a community. Abdul Baha spent several days in Germany, yes, traveling through Germany. So I guess those would be the France, Germany, Switzerland, and England would be kind of the four that I would mention kind of developed simultaneously at the time. And I'm not sure that they had the same lull in the 1930s. That's something I don't know, but which I would be interested to know if it was a similar phenomenon elsewhere.
United States.
Of course, yes, exactly, yeah, obviously.
It's simply marvelous, what you told us. This
Yes, and
this
you understand that.
branching out, this collecting people. marvelous,
Yeah.
really.
You understand
Thank you.
about what was presented is a very Sisyphic, work to find every item,
Yes, I understand.
small item, as you could see the clips from the newspaper.
It's absolutely,
It's,
absolutely marvelous.
yes.
Really.
Czech Republic also.
Czech Republic, okay, yes, good, thank you.
But maybe just to give you an idea about the spread of the religion. Well, at the first phases, it was of course from Persia to Baghdad, to Ottoman Empire, adjacent areas, and then it slowly developed in other parts of north of Iran and towards the west. So it was gradual. Yes. Yes, Iran.
Can you tell us anything about the community today in Switzerland? There is any connection with the community?
Really?
When is or there is different branches that?
Yeah, there are a number of descendants of the early Baha'is who are still members of the Baha'i community. The very first Baha'i, Edith McKay, her granddaughter is still a member of the Baha'i faith, and she's just taken upon herself to write a 3-volume manuscript about her grandmother, and she's just completed it. It's unfortunately it's only in, I think she made 10 copies and sent them to the National Archives in Switzerland, and she sent me a copy. So, but I'm encouraging her to to make it available for others. So that's one source. The descendants of Auguste Forel, his granddaughter was a major source of information for my work on Forel. Interestingly, his family, part of his family that was in Germany carried on the Baha'i tradition. His family that was in Switzerland did not. And actually that was the reason why that stimulated me to do my dissertation on Auguste Forel and the Baha'i faith, because one of my colleagues when I was a junior doctor was the grandson of Forel. And I just offhand mentioned that I was a Baha'i and that I knew that his grandfather was Baha'i also. And he immediately says, "Oh, no, not at all. He was interested in the Baha'i faith, but he was always an atheist." So, I was kind of taken back because I was very enthusiastic, but I wanted to get to the bottom of it. I didn't want to be spreading false rumors, and if the family said that, it was to be taken seriously. So that's why I wanted to get to the bottom of the fact, was Forel Baha'i or not, and obviously he himself said he was, and my research, all the sources I consulted, except his family, said that he wasn't. And it's interesting because Forel had so many papers. The Ants Nest, you saw how big it was. It was full of his papers, and unfortunately, there's only a small amount of it that is left. And the story about that small amount was interesting. I contacted the owner of the place later on, and to see if there were maybe some papers still left there. And he says, no, what happened when I acquired the place, Forel's son had thrown all of his papers into the yard and had called the dump truck to come and pick them up. And there was a school teacher in the local high school who went by and realized what was sitting there and just grabbed what he could and then gave that to the university library. So that was the only thing that we have. And unfortunately, the original in the handwriting of Abdul Baha of this answer to Forel was perhaps among those papers. We have an authenticated copy by Shoghi Effendi, but the original may have been among those because we haven't found it. So that just to show you that his family in Switzerland didn't really appreciate the significance, not only from a Baha'i standpoint, but all the other things that he did that were worth preserving, but which were not.
Or maybe they were so Christian in their faith, so they resented this.
They were very atheist.
Oh, atheist. well, other.
Yeah, other.
Yes.
Exactly.
So
Yeah,
maybe that's the reason that
that's
probably
true.
there is a lot of tension within the family. And
That's perhaps, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yes, please. I see from a historical point of view, historiographer point of view, you work through a lot of archives, League of Nations, and What about the Swiss archives? I mean, is there any material there, or
The Swiss government archives, for example.
government,
Yeah.
national archives,
Yeah.
whatever?
I've tried to look up references, for example, in the foreign affairs
Yes.
about perhaps relationships
Yes,
with the
Persia.
with Persia. Exact. I didn't find anything, but it was a very sort of. I didn't have time really to go into it in detail. I just kind of looked for
So it needs
passing
more
reference.
exploring.
It needs a lot more reference too. There are some archives. Well, for example, the Save the Children Fund that Lady Bloomfield was active in.
Yes.
Their archives are
Sorry.
in Geneva, and I found a number of references to Lady Bloomfield in their minutes. But when I went there, that was 2 years ago. They were in the process of organizing their archives, so I have to go back there.
Yeah.
Very annoying.
Yeah, it is. Well, but at least I know that there's more work to do.
Yes.
So I have to go back there. A number of the universities of Basel, Zurich, and Lausanne have important sources. The Baudouin archives, I'd still like to get back there and find out again what happened to the contact with Baudouin. There's still a lot of work to do, so it's very much in progress.
Yes, please. What about is there any community of Azalis? I mean,
Yeah.
in Switzerland and
There are not to my knowledge,
No,
anyway.
okay.
Now, it's interesting because there is there's one person in Switzerland who took up the cause of claiming that the will and testament of Abdul Baha was a falsification.
okay.
And it's interesting because this one person has been received a lot of support from the Protestant churches, and it's interesting that the fact that the reference from Dr. Falscher is so clear as to who the successor of Abdul Baha would be, and this is and it's from a Swiss source, that it's quite incredible that this person would have received so much attention from the Protestant churches, but his book was widely distributed. And, but it's only one person who's made a lot of noise.
Okay. Yes. So I see that there is no other questions. I can only thank you again
Thank you.
for opening our eyes to a fascinating field, and I can only wish you success in your continuation of your research.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming. It was
Thank you for
pleasure
the
having you.
invitation. Thank you for the
Thank you.
invitation.